Have you ever been faced with a situation so dire that survival seemed impossible? Picture this: a small group of outlaws, surrounded by thousands of soldiers, trapped in the harshest desert terrain, with no way out. The situation seemed hopeless. But then, something unexpected happened. What these men did next wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a psychological battle that would shock the military itself. What could have possibly made this group of cangaceiros stand their ground in the face of certain death? Was it sheer will, or was there something far deeper at play? In the unforgiving Brazilian backlands, where the desert heat tests the limits of human endurance, the cangaceiros had mastered something that no soldier could have prepared for: patience. While the military marched in, their soldiers confident that victory was certain, the cangaceiros sat still, silent. And what was even more unsettling was how long they could endure that silence. No one expected them to hold on, to withstand the pressure, to let the tension build until it snapped back with a force no one could have predicted. This wasn't just a standoff, it wasn't just an attack or an ambush. What the military faced wasn't an army, they were facing a movement, a mentality that could endure anything, that could turn the very art of war into a game of nerves. The cangaceiros didn't react the way anyone would have expected. Instead of breaking, they stood firm, not just physically, but mentally, drawing the military in with the very silence that seemed to guarantee their doom. And then, when the moment came, it came with an explosive force that completely disoriented their captors. How could a group of men, outnumbered and surrounded, turn the tables on one of the most powerful military forces in Brazil? It wasn't brute strength that won the day, it was the ability to control the battlefield of the mind. The cangaceiros knew that the real battle wasn't about weapons, but about the psychology of warfare. And it would take more than just firepower to defeat them. It would take something the military had underestimated: their resolve. So, what was their secret? How did they keep their composure while the odds stacked higher and higher against them? Their next move would surprise everyone, but not in the way you'd think. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn is a strategy that redefined the way we think about warfare, survival, and leadership in the most extreme conditions. Cite for comments. What do you think? Would you have stood firm under such pressure? Share your thoughts with me in the comments below. Your perspective might surprise us all. Don't forget to leave a like if you're as intrigued by this story as I am. And check if you're subscribed to the channel. There's so much more to uncover in the history of Brazil's most daring outlaws. Stay with me for the next part. It's going to get even more intense. What if the most powerful weapon in war isn't a gun, a sword, or an army, but the mind? When the cangaceiros faced off against the Brazilian military, they didn't just rely on brute force. No, their real strength came from something far more insidious: their ability to control the battlefield of the mind. What made these desert outlaws so terrifying wasn't just their skill with weapons, but their deep understanding of psychological warfare, something that would completely shake the military to its core. Imagine the scene: the military, well-trained and confident, surrounds the cangaceiros in the desert, a moment that seems to signal their end. It's a scenario the army had encountered countless times before, but this time was different. The cangaceiros weren't panicking. They weren't retreating. In fact, they were doing something the army couldn't understand. They were waiting. And in that waiting, they weren't just preserving their strength, they were preparing their enemies to make the ultimate mistake. This was the essence of the Cangaço spirit, a psychological strategy that confused, disoriented, and ultimately destabilized their enemies. The cangaceiros had perfected the art of making the enemy question their own actions. Every move, every silence, every slight gesture was a calculated step in a game that the military didn't even realize they were playing. While the soldiers expected a direct fight, the cangaceiros made them fight on their terms, in their minds, where fear and doubt could destroy more than any bullet ever could. It wasn't just about surviving the fight, it was about controlling the narrative. The cangaceiros knew that when the mind is under siege, even the most powerful army can falter. They were masters at creating confusion, causing the enemy to second-guess every move, every decision. The military, expecting a conventional battle, found themselves trapped in a psychological maze where every attempt to attack felt like it was playing right into the hands of the Cangaço. But what was the real goal? The cangaceiros weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to dominate the mental battlefield. The military thought they were facing criminals, outlaws, mere men of violence. But what they encountered was something more complex. A group of individuals who had turned their fight for survival into an intellectual and emotional struggle. The cangaceiros didn't need to win every battle. They only needed to make the army believe they couldn't win at all. And in this war of nerves, they were the undisputed masters. What happened next was the shocking outcome of a strategy so effective that it left the military reeling. They had underestimated their enemy, not in terms of firepower or strategy, but in terms of mind games, a lesson that would haunt them for years. In the heart of Brazil's dry, unforgiving deserts, survival wasn't just a matter of food and water, it was a matter of the mind. For the cangaceiros, the real challenge wasn't the heat or the terrain. It was maintaining the mental strength to endure the impossible. These outlaws, hardened by years of living on the edge of death, had mastered a set of rituals that transformed them from mere men into something far more formidable, legends. Imagine spending days, weeks, months on end in a barren land, with every step taken under the scorching sun, each breath thick with dust. The world around you is silent, a dead, endless stretch of nothingness. Yet, in the midst of this, the cangaceiros thrived. How did they do it? It wasn't luck, nor was it simply survival. Instinct. It was the rituals they followed. These rituals weren't just about practical preparation, they were about mental and spiritual endurance, a way of fortifying themselves against the brutal world they lived in. One of the most powerful of these rituals was silence. In the midst of a life defined by violence and struggle, silence became their shield. It was in these moments of silence, when the outside world faded into the background, that the cangaceiros found clarity. They learned to listen not to the sounds of battle, but to the whispers of their own thoughts. These moments of stillness gave them the power to focus, to center themselves, and to prepare for whatever lay ahead. But silence was only the beginning. They also relied on physical rituals that tested their limit. The cangaceiros often walked for days without rest, their feet raw and their bodies on the brink of collapse, but they didn't break. Their rituals, a combination of endurance and faith, gave them the strength to keep moving when it seemed impossible. They would march through the deserts, not as men, but as a collective force, bound by a shared purpose. These rituals also had a spiritual dimension. The cangaceiros weren't just hardened outlaws. They were warriors fighting for something much larger than themselves. Their belief in a higher cause, often rooted in a complex mix of religion and survival, gave them a sense of purpose that carried them through even the darkest moments. Each prayer, each chant, each symbolic gesture was a reaffirmation of their resilience, a reminder that they were more than their circumstances. What made these rituals so effective wasn't just the physical strength they built, it was the psychological resilience they forged. By constantly pushing themselves, the cangaceiros created a mental toughness that allowed them to face overwhelming odds without flinching. They didn't just endure, they thrived. And it wasn't just a matter of surviving the next battle, it was about winning the war within, mastering their minds before they could master their enemies. In the face of impossible odds, the cangaceiros didn't just fight for survival, they fought to control their fate. Their rituals were the foundation of this control, giving them the power to shape the battlefield in ways their enemies could never anticipate. As the military closed in on them, they remained unfazed, their minds sharp, and their spirits unbroken. This was the real power of the cangaceiros, their ability to endure and fight not just with weapons, but with their minds. And as they prepared for the next phase of their resistance, the question remained, would the military ever truly understand what they were up against? The military had the cangaceiros cornered. There was no way out. Their soldiers were confident, ready to crush what they believed were mere outlaws, unorganized and on the brink of collapse. The army's victory seemed inevitable. But then, something happened that the military didn't anticipate: a shift in the tides, so subtle yet so powerful that it changed the course of this confrontation forever. What the army didn't understand was that they were not fighting just another group of criminals. The cangaceiros were not an ordinary gang. They had something the military didn't: absolute, unshakable resolve. As the soldiers closed in, they expected the cangaceiros to break under pressure. But instead, they saw something they couldn't comprehend. The cangaceiros stood firm, calm/focused, silent. It was a strange sign: soldiers waiting, the cangaceiros waiting, in a tension so thick it seemed to weigh down the very air around them. But the army's confusion soon turned to unease. What they had expected to be a battle of strength was now becoming a battle of minds, a test of endurance that they hadn't prepared for. And in that moment, it became clear that the military wasn't just fighting an outlaw group. They were fighting a movement, a collective force that couldn't be easily defeated by traditional military tactics. The cangaceiros had learned to make time their ally. Every second, every breath they took was part of a grand strategy. The longer the military waited, the more the cangaceiros wore them down mentally. It wasn't just about holding their ground. It was about making the army doubt itself, questioning its own strategies, its own readiness. The longer the standoff continued, the more uncertain the soldiers became about their victory. Then came the twist, the moment when the cangaceiros struck back. It wasn't an all-out assault. It was far more calculated, far more insidious. The cangaceiros had set traps, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the military leaders. They had made the enemies second-guess every decision, sowing confusion within the ranks, making the soldiers wonder if they were the ones being led into a trap. The first attack was swift and brutal, but it wasn't the physical force that shook the military. It was the realization that they had underestimated their opponents. The cangaceiros, outnumbered and surrounded, had turned the tables. They had become the hunters, and the military, once so confident of its victory, had become the prey. The military's leaders, caught off guard by the cangaceiros' ability to think and act in ways they hadn't expected, began to realize they were not in control of the situation. This was no longer a conventional fight. It was a battle of wills, of nerves, and the cangaceiros had proven that they could outlast, outthink, and outmaneuver the best that the military had to offer. They had shaken the foundation of what the army believed was a sure victory. And yet, the true horror of the military's situation was only beginning. What they were witnessing wasn't just the cangaceiros' survival, it was their mastery of psychological warfare, something that would haunt the army long after the dust had settled. The world of the cangaceiros was built on loyalty, trust, and a code of honor that set them apart from any other group of outlaws. While the military surrounded them and enemies sought to break their spirit, it wasn't the weapons or brute strength that kept them going, it was the unbreakable bond between them. But what happens when loyalty is tested in the heat of battle? How far would the cangaceiros go to protect one another? And what price would they pay if that bond was ever broken? In the deserts of Brazil, where every day could be your last, the cangaceiros adhered to a strict set of rules that governed not just their actions, but their very souls. Loyalty wasn't just a choice, it was a way of life. Betrayal was an unforgivable sin, and anyone who crossed the line paid the ultimate price. But here's the twist. This code didn't just apply to their enemies, it applied to their own, too. As the cangaceiros stood ready to face the military, they knew that their survival depended on their unity. Every man, every woman was bound to one another by this unspoken agreement. No one fights alone. In the face of overwhelming odds, the cangaceiros didn't just rely on their weapons, they relied on the trust they had built with each other over countless battles and years of hardship. It was this bond that made them formidable, not just as individuals, but as a cohesive, unbreakable force. But loyalty can also be a double-edged sword. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the cangaceiros were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for each other. But what happens when loyalty is tested by desperation, or when the price of survival seems too high to pay. The line between loyalty and betrayal became blurred, and the consequences were far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. What made the Cangaçeiros code so unique was that it wasn't just about loyalty to the group. It was also about loyalty to a cause, a shared sense of purpose that transcended personal survival. This code gave them strength, but it also led to sacrifices that few could comprehend. Some cangaceiros were asked to make decisions that no one should ever have to face, sacrifices that tested their very humanity. One of the most powerful examples of this code in action came when the cangaceiros were faced with a difficult choice. A member of their group had been captured by the military, and the decision to either leave him behind or risk the entire group's safety to free him weighed heavily on everyone. The cangaceiros knew that to abandon one of their own would break their code of honoring, yet to risk the lives of all for one could have meant the end of their entire resistance. The tension was unbearable, but what happened next shocked even their enemies. Rather than simply surrender or retreat, the cangaceiros found a way to outmaneuver their captors. They did not abandon their comrade, and they did not sacrifice their honor. Instead, they used their unity and their code to launch a daring rescue mission that defied all expectations, proving that their loyalty to each other and to their cause was stronger than any obstacle they faced. The lesson here is clear. While the military may have had more resources, more manpower, and more weapons, the cangaceiros had something far more powerful, an unbreakable bond. Their loyalty was a weapon that no army could ever replicate, a force that allowed them to face impossible odds and still come out victorious. In the world of the cangaceiros, betrayal was unti, justification was an impossibility. Their strength came not from weapons, but from their honor, their loyalty, and the unshakable trust they placed in one another. As the battle continued, it became increasingly clear that the cangaceiros' code of honor was not just a moral compass, it was a strategic advantage. The military could fight them on the battlefield, but they could never defeat the spirit that bound them together. The cangaceiros were surrounded. The Brazilian military had them pinned in a remote part of the desert, and every sign pointed to an inevitable defeat. The odds were stacked against them: more soldiers, more weapons, more resources. But as the military prepared for a quick, decisive end, the cangaceiros did something that no one had anticipated. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They outwitted their captors in a way that left the military completely off balance, stunned by the cunning of their adversaries. What the military didn't realize was that they weren't just fighting outlaws. They were facing a group of individuals who had learned to turn every disadvantage into a calculated move. The cangaceiros didn't just rely on traditional guerrilla warfare tactics. They understood that the real battlefield wasn't just in the open, it was in the minds of their enemies. And that's exactly where the cangaceiros struck first. The military, confident in their superiority, had surrounded the cangaceiros, thinking they had them cornered. But the outlaws weren't merely waiting for their fate. They were biding their time, preparing their next move, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The cangaceiros had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is not by force but by forcing them into a position where they lose the will to fight. As the military grew complacent, believing victory was certain, the cangaceiros began to sow confusion. They didn't attack head-on. Instead, they began using their environment to their advantage, creating false leads and misdirecting the military into chasing shadows. The cangaceiros knew the terrain like the back of their hands. Every mountain pass, every hidden cave, every narrow trail became part of their escape route. But they weren't just trying to escape, they were laying a trap. They made the military chase them across the desert, moving in ways that seemed erratic and unpredictable. The soldiers were confused. They began to question whether they were truly in control. The cangaceiros, with their knowledge of the land and their deep understanding of military psychology, had turned the tables without even firing a shot. At one point, the military believed they had cornered the cangaceiros in a canyon. The soldiers waited, weapons at the ready, expecting a desperate last stand. But when they finally entered the canyon, there was no fight. The cangaceiros had disappeared. The military, frustrated and confused, couldn't understand how the outlaws had vanished so quickly, so silently. The cangaceiros had used the natural landscape to create an illusion of being trapped, only to slip away at the last moment. This wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The military was left wondering what had happened, questioning their own tactics and strategy. It wasn't just about the fights. It was about how the cangaceiros had made the army doubt their ability to win. And in that doubt, they found their victory. What the cangaceiros did wasn't just about evasion. It was about making their enemies feel powerless. The military thought they were chasing criminals, but what they were really chasing was a collective, a movement that could think and act in ways they could never anticipate. The cangaceiro strategy was simple, yet brilliant. Make the enemy question their own decisions. Make them second-guess every move. And in doing so, create an environment where the enemy became their own worst enemy. By the time the military realized what had happened, the cangaceiros were already miles away, hidden once again in the desert, ready to strike when the time was right. The soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, had been outplayed. They had underestimated not just the fighting ability of the cangaceiros, but their ability to control the battlefield of the mind. The turning point had come not through force, but through intelligence. The cangaceiros didn't need to win with strength, they needed to win with strategy. And in this battle of wits, they had proven themselves masters of deception, making the military feel like they were chasing ghosts. In the brutal world of the Cangaço, one of the most powerful forces that kept them alive was not their weapons, but their unbreakable bond with one another. It wasn't just a group of outlaws, these were men and women united by a sense of brotherhood that transcended mere survival. In the face of death, they didn't just fight as individuals, they fought together, their fates intertwined. They understood that in a world so merciless, the only way to stand strong was to stand together. The cangaceiros' loyalty to one another was their greatest strength. In the desert where every step could lead to their end, they relied on one another in ways that no ordinary group of criminals could. Their bond was forged not just through battle, but through shared hardships, hunger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. It was in these moments of despair that their brotherhood became most apparent. Imagine the scene: a group of cangaceiros surrounded by the military, facing the possibility of being wiped out. In that moment, it wasn't the individual who mattered, it was the group. They knew that they would either survive together or not. Each person's fate was bound to the others. If one fell, the rest would carry on the fight. No questions asked. There was no room for fear or hesitation, because to hesitate was to risk losing everything. But what made their brotherhood even more powerful was the way they faced death together. It wasn't just about fighting side by side, it was about understanding that their time might come at any moment, and when it did, they would face it without fear. They didn't mourn the inevitable death of their comrades. Instead, they celebrated their courage and continued the fight. Each death was a reminder of their cause, a cause greater than any individual. This band wasn't just a matter of loyalty, it was a matter of survival. In the desert, where death was a constant companion, the cangaceiros knew that their strength lay in their unity. The desert itself was a harsh, unforgiving environment, but together they found ways to survive, to adapt, and to outwit their enemies. But even this unbreakable brotherhood was tested when the military captured one of their own. The cangaceiros had to make a decision that would define their survival. Would they risk everything to rescue their comrade, or would they abandon him to save themselves? The choice was clear to them. No one was left behind. Their bond to each other was stronger than any fear, and they would risk everything to bring their brother back. The military, confident that the cangaceiros would abandon their own to save themselves, didn't count on this fierce loyalty. What they didn't realize was that the cangaceiros didn't view themselves as individuals, they viewed themselves as a collective, a force greater than the sum of their parts. Their brotherhood was their greatest weapon, and it was a weapon the military couldn't understand. This unbreakable bond allowed the cangaceiros to push past the limits of what seemed possible. In the face of overwhelming odds, they did what others wouldn't dare. They fought for each other, not just for survival, but for the spirit that bound them together. And one of them fell. The rest carried on the fight, keeping the memory of their comrades alive. This was the true power of the cangaceiros, their ability to fight not just for themselves, but for the bond that tied them together, a bond that death itself could not break. The cangaceiros did more than just fight the Brazilian military, they changed the very nature of warfare itself. What began as a fight for survival in the harsh Brazilian deserts evolved into a movement that would leave a lasting mark on military strategy and the way resistance movements would operate for generations to come. The cangaceiros were not just rebels in the desert, they were pioneers in guerrilla warfare, shaping the course of history in ways that few could have imagined. At the heart of their legacy was their ability to adapt. While conventional armies relied on traditional battle, tactics, heavy weaponry, organized formations, and brute force, the cangaceiros used their environment to their advantage. They didn't just fight in the desert, they mastered it. Every rock, every valley, every twist in the terrain became part of their strategy. They didn't need to face their enemies head-on. They could strike and vanish, using the landscape to confuse and disorient the military. But it wasn't just about the terrain, it was about how the cangaceiros used time and patience as weapons. While the military expected fast, decisive confrontations, the cangaceiros understood that war isn't just about fighting. It's about wearing down your enemy, making them question their every move. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more the military's resolve weakened. The cangaceiros weren't trying to win every battle, they were trying to outlast the military. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes the best way to win a war is simply to make the other side lose hope. Their tactics were built on flexibility and unpredictability. The cangaceiros didn't fight in the same way twice. They kept their enemies guessing, never allowing the military to anticipate their next move. They would retreat, then strike from unexpected directions, creating chaos in the military's ranks. This unpredictability made them incredibly difficult to defeat. The military, confident in their superior numbers and firepower, found themselves trapped in a battle of attrition that they hadn't prepared for. This kind of warfare didn't just challenge the military, it revolutionized the way resistance movements would operate. The cangaceiros showed that even a small, under-equipped group could stand up to a powerful army if they had the right strategies and the right mindset. Their legacy would influence countless guerrilla movements across the world, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan. The lessons learned in the deserts of Brazil were applied in countless other struggles, proving that the cangaceiros were far ahead of their time. But the true genius of the cangaceiros was their ability to inspire others. They didn't just fight for survival, they fought for a cause, for a way of life that resonated with the oppressed and the downtrodden. The cangaceiros' struggle became a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for those who refused to bow to power. Their legacy wasn't just about military strategy, it was about inspiring generations to stand up against injustice, no matter the odds. And so, the cangaceiros' impact went beyond the battlefield. They didn't just change the way wars were fought, they changed the way people thought about resistance. They proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, even when surrounded and outnumbered, a well-organized, determined group could make a difference. Their story wasn't just one of survival, it was one of revolution, of challenging the status quo, and of leaving a mark on history that would never be erased. When the cangaceiros finally disappeared from the front lines, it wasn't just their enemies who were left wondering what had happened. It was the military itself. The sudden shift in the tide of battle had left the army stunned, and their victory was no longer a certainty. Despite their best efforts, the military was forced to reckon with the fact that they had failed to defeat a group of outlaws who, against all odds, had turned the tables and disappeared without a trace. The military's confidence had been shattered, not just by the cangaceiros' ability to evade capture, but by the psychological toll the resistance had taken on their soldiers. Throughout the conflict, the army had believed it was in control, that their superior numbers and firepower would win the day. But the cangaceiros had demonstrated something far more powerful: the ability to manipulate the psychological battlefield. When the dust settled, the army found itself questioning everything it had believed about the nature of warfare. How had the cangaceiros managed to evade capture so? Why had they been able to break the military's resolve without a direct confrontation. What started as a simple guerrilla campaign had become a study in psychological warfare, leaving the military reeling and completely unprepared for the new kind of resistance it had faced. The cangaceiros' tactics had shown the military that traditional approaches to combat were not enough. It wasn't enough to have the most soldiers, the best equipment, or the strongest strategy. What the cangaceiros proved was that intelligence, adaptability, and mental fortitude could overcome even the most well-equipped army. And, in doing so, they left a lasting impression on military leaders who would later analyze the campaign and learn from the cangaceiros' strategies. What the military also didn't expect was the cultural impact the cangaceiros would have on the Brazilian people. They didn't just fight for their own survival, they became symbols of resistance. For many, the cangaceiros represented the fight against oppression, a reminder that even the smallest group could stand up against a powerful force. They weren't just outlaws. They were heroes in the eyes of the oppressed, a symbol of defiance against a system that sought to crush them. This wasn't a fight won just on the battlefield. It was a fight for the hearts and minds of the people. And in that respect, the cangaceiros had already won. Their legacy lived on in the stories told by those who witnessed their bravery, in the songs sung about their courage, and in the lives of those who remembered their fight. The military may have declared victory, but the cangaceiros had already captured the imagination of Brazil. In the aftermath, the military tried to rebuild, to analyze what had gone wrong. They had learned a hard lesson, one that would stay with them for years to come. The cangaceiros had proven that resistance was not just about fighting with weapons, it was about fighting with resolve, with strategy, and with the belief that you could defy the odds and win. In the end, it was the cangaceiros' ability to create that belief that made them more dangerous than any army could ever be. The cangaceiros were gone as quickly as they had come. One moment, they were surrounded and seemingly doomed, and the next, they had vanished into the Brazilian back, leaving the military to wonder what had just happened. The disappearance of the cangaceiros wasn't just a retreat, it was a strategic vanishing act, one that left a sense of mystery lingering in the air. What happened to them after they disappeared from the front line? How did a group of outlaws manage to elude capture, even when surrounded by an army? The military's failure to capture or defeat the cangaceiros became one of the most discussed and puzzling aspects of the conflict. The army, accustomed to seeing clear victories, had underestimated the depth of the cangaceiros' strategy and their ability to evade the military's grasp. But what really shocked the soldiers was how the cangaceiros didn't simply escape. They left behind no trace, no clue as to where they had gone. It was as if they had never been there at all. For years, the mystery of the cangaceiros' disappearance remained unsolved. The military and historians alike were left to speculate. Did they simply melt into the desert, using their extensive knowledge of the land to evade every attempt to track them down? Did they somehow forge alliances with other outlaw groups, retreating into the mountains or the jungles, where the military would never dare to follow? Or was there something more at play, something that the military couldn't understand or foresee? What was even more perplexing was the legacy they left behind. Despite disappearing from the front lines, the cangaceiros became more than just outlaws. They became a symbol of resistance, a part of Brazilian folklore. Their disappearance wasn't the end of their story, it was the beginning of a myth that would live on for generations. For some, the cangaceiros' vanishing act was a tactical retreat, a way to fight another day. But for others, their disappearance took on a more mystical quality. The idea that a small group of outlaws could escape an entire army, vanish without a trace, and leave the military reeling for years to come was something that couldn't be explained by conventional military thinking. It was as if they had become ghosts, vanishing into the very fabric of the land they fought to protect. And even today, the mystery remains. The cangaceiros' true fate is one of the great unanswered questions of Brazilian history. Some say they simply disappeared into the vast wilderness, blending with the land they knew so well. Others believe that they went underground, continuing their fight in secret, far from the eyes of the military. What's certain is that their disappearance only added to their mystique, making their story one of the most intriguing in the history of Brazilian resistance. Their legacy, though, is undeniable. Even after their final battle, their influence endured. the cangaceiros became legends figures whose stories were passed down through generations, inspiring new waves of resistance movements. Their ability to fight not just with weapons, but with strategy, endurance, and psychological warfare changed the way future generations thought about insurgency and defiance. But the biggest question remains, what really happened to the cangaceiros after they disappeared? Did they survive? And if so, what did they do in the years following their great escape? Or did they truly vanish into the sands of time, leaving behind only their story, their legacy, and their mystery? As we reflect on their extraordinary resistance, we can't help but ask ourselves, did the cangaceiros really disappear, or is their story still unfolding in ways we'll never fully understand?